All right. I think we can get started so we can make sure we end on time. So, hello, everyone. Hi. Are you ready?
We're ready.
Okay, let's go.
Wow us.
Wow.
Prepare to be wowed. That should have been the name of our talk. So, this is Annie.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Annie Polland. I'm the Vice President for Programs and Education at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum in New York. And I want to tell you, and this is Phillip Tiongson from Potion Design, and we've been working on this and thinking about different ways to present it, and this is probably like the fourth iteration. This has been something we've been thinking about a lot. And so what you're seeing in some ways is very much a work in progress. And yesterday, after the keynote speech, we sat down and kind of reshuffled everything again. We were really inspired by the way Liz Ogbu talked about objects being part of ecosystems and the importance of humanity. So she talked about cook stoves and she talked about market stalls and the idea that you couldn't remake those without understanding how people were using them. And that, to us, reemphasized our own dedication and inspiration to people and the reason why we're creating these interactive activities. So we wanted to kind of go back to the people, and that will be a recurring theme in this exploration.
So, and I'm Phillip Tiongson, and I'm the principal of a design firm called Potion. I think that I'm working out a new statement. Potion creates unique, responsive experiences dedicated to amplifying humanity, sharing ideas, fostering empathy, and motivating change. And I think that in the work that we've done with Tenement, this is some of the best work that illustrates sort of us sort of fulfilling our mission. And so it's been really an honor to work with Annie over a pretty long period of time now. And so I hope that we can show between how our interactions, when you're thinking about making your own digital storytelling projects, and we're really hoping to give you some ways to think about what you want to make, and sort of, because I think there's a lot of confusion around that term, digital storytelling. And so that's what we're going to sort of talk about today, and then give you some sort of guidelines that I think that we've come up with, but also a way for, hopefully a framework for you to help decide what's important to you. So our first collaboration was in 2006. And again, the first was at the Eldridge Street, the museum at Eldridge Street, which is a synagogue on the Lower East Side. Then at 2011, Annie was at the Tenement Museum, and we worked on a piece called Shop Life. This year, we just launched a new digital storytelling site called Your Stories, Our Stories, and we're actually working on a physical, a new physical tour and exhibit in the style that Tenement does, and Annie will actually explain that a little bit later. Right now. So now, we've now been working together for over a decade, or we will be working with over a decade, which I think is a pretty long time for sort of a studio and an institution to work together. So we've gotten really to know each other and our values and culture.
And I think that is one of the things that I think is most important, not just what we create, but how we create. And the importance of, when you are going to create an interactive, to find the right partners between content and digital, because when you do that, your storyline can be amplified so much by the digital opportunities. And I think the digital opportunities also expand in relationship to stories. So we wanted to talk a little bit about that process, as well as kind of how our experiences together helped us shape new projects. And so also, this kind of all came about because the NEH, the National Endowment for the Humanities, came to us and said, came to me, kind of, and said, what do you think about proposing a conference on digital storytelling for museums? What do you think about bringing together people in the museum field to discuss what this is and what it means and how to do it? What they had been seeing is a lot of interest in digital storytelling, and they want to encourage it, but they're also seeing a lot of confusion around what that means, and they're also seeing opportunities that larger institutions have versus fewer opportunities that sometimes smaller museums have. So they came to us I think, because we're not a museum that you would expect to have digital programming. We're not a museum that has a department dedicated to the digital. We're a house museum that has, made its reputation on human-driven, educator-led tours through an old building. So I think they picked us not because we're superstars, but they picked us because we're very traditional, yet we're willing to experiment with using digital technology. And when we experimented with digital technology, we still held true to kind of the core humanities principles that had motivated a lot of the storytelling we had done before. So in going into digital, we still kept the importance of humanities scholarship. And so they said, would you take this and open up this conference and host it and invite people? So part of the reason we're doing this panel is to publicize that, so we invite you to be part of that, and we'll talk more about that. But one of the things we said we would do, and we said we would do it very foolishly, is we said that we would try to define digital storytelling for museums. And of course, it's a very hard process, and we've only begun that process, and we don't think what we realize is we're not going to. We're going to be able to define it for us, and I think also give people the tools to help define it for them.
So, we were thinking, how can we make this fruitful for you? So you're coming here, and, why should my museum make digital stories? And I think that this is a really good question to ask. There are many ways to spend your resources, and even though I run a digital studio, technically, it's not always the right choice, and there's some real challenges that are involved. But I think that why do we even call it digital storytelling? We don't really think about TV storytelling or book storytelling or movie storytelling, where the medium is attached to or modifies the kind of storytelling. It's all storytelling. But Annie, again, in our conversation, there is an exception to that. And that exception is actually oral storytelling. And oral storytelling has a unique relationship between sort of the audience and the storyteller. And I think the audience is able to interact with the sort of author or performer in the moment that is happening. The audience provides feedback in sort of a real-time way. If you've ever heard, a really good storyteller, they're modifying that story for you or for this audience or for in that moment. And it can be quite touching, and it can be quite compelling. And that story can change sort of in real time. And so I think that that's an interesting, different way of looking at what digital storytelling means, is that digital isn't about the medium, it's not the book, but it's a new process. It's like oral storytelling, but it's not oral storytelling, but there's a relationship. And so, and I put the triple star up there. So what digital storytelling means for us, as we've come to define it, is that the audience has the opportunity to interact with the story process. So they have some way to touch it. And I think that digital as a medium doesn't necessarily require that, but I think digital storytelling should. Second, that the audience has some connection in that, in that real-time oral way, you can by the way you smile, or you're I'm falling asleep, right now, all of you, it gives you that connection. And in this way, digital storytelling has that opportunity for there to be feedback so that the audience can participate in a dialogue with, a museum or an institution or with the author. And the story can change over time through feedback or in real time, depending on how that's designed. And I think that this is one piece that really adds, is that, digital storytelling uses technology to tell stories in ways that were impossible or impractical before, right? So when you think about something that has, 1,000 authors, or something where you're collecting many pieces, that was just impractical to try to collate that in a manual way before. And so we think that digital storytelling, that's one of the components that make it interesting. So in this definition, CDs and Netflix don't qualify as digital storytelling, even though they may be originated digitally, they might be distributed digitally, but because they don't sort of fall into these other criteria, that it's more like a movie or a film, right? So I think that what we can talk about a little bit is that the work that led us sort of to this direction. So.
So the museum at Alder Street, as Phillip said, is a National Historic Landmark that's located on New York's Lower East Side. And you can see the facade of the synagogue. It's kind of right in the middle of Chinatown, which is a kind of exciting experience to come upon it. And the sanctuary was restored and opened in 2007. And as part of that restoration, we had a grant to do interpretive work on the lower level of this building. And so that we were able to go to the lower level, which is here, and install these tables. And we were really excited about doing them. I was super excited because I had come from a background in history. I got a PhD in history. While I was writing my dissertation, I started giving walking tours of the neighborhood. And so this is actually a map of the Lower East Side that was inspired by my research, but also by experience teaching that to real people on the streets of the Lower East Side. And so you could press on buildings, get more information, swoop down, be able to find more about a building. And then some of the sites had more interactive games. So our favorite one was for the Jewish Daily Forward building a newspaper, in which you could put together your own newspaper, and in putting together the newspaper, learn about how vital the newspaper was to the time, learn about the choices. There were 5 different Yiddish newspapers in one given time, so they represented different political affiliations and all sorts of things. And so by putting together mastheads, you could choose mastheads, you could choose articles, and these were real articles that we translated. These are then responses to what you've chosen, so you get a sense of who are the different personalities and characters on the Lower East Side. You got ads. This is a furniture store. There was another ad for, like, parents, get your children to buy a High Holiday book so they'll come to High Holiday services. Right? So and letters to the editor. And so there was this real immersion in primary sources. So early on in my museum career, I discovered the potential for this media to bring primary sources, something that was impossible otherwise, into the hands, literally, of visitors who would not have been able to access them before. And this is another table we did that went through kind of the map of the sanctuary and also the architectural restoration process. And so what you'll see in just a moment is a little game.
This is almost, 10 years ago.
Yes.
So you'll see Annie here,
Yes.
captured for eternity.
Before I had gray hair. So it is me in there. And what was kind of fun about this is when we designed this, it was designed in some ways as a standalone, something that someone would be working on their own before they entered the sanctuary. But then in practice, we really loved when kids would come, and we were able to kind of design it for more than one person, just kind of by modifying the way you stood in front of it and coming up with ways to group manage so that kids could then access it. So this is a group of 3rd graders from the neighborhood who got very excited about putting together this stained glass window, and it was a great thing that we would do before entering the actual sanctuary. So they had kind of a hands-on experience before entering. And obviously, we should have made the table bigger if we knew that it would work in this way. But again, with a human there, you could manage it so that the kids really had an interactive experience. But through this process, we realized how important it was for us to be able to create digital interactives that were not just individual interactives, but rather ones that could work for groups of people. What I will say, though, is that one of the things that was really hard, and this is, I think, the biggest takeaway we can give, is that it's so important when you create an interactive to make sure it aligns with the culture of your institution so that it's supported, and so that it's supported even when personnel leave. So for example, in this case, when I left the tenement, when I left Eldridge Street, there was then no hiring done to bring in more educators. They brought in more educators, but there was no commitment to getting a staff of educators that could man tables like this, or woman tables like this. And so that was a key thing, that unless you have institutional buy-in across the board, and really thinking what that means with regard to not just to IT, but to staffing, that was key. And so the good.
I think that again, what another way is to relate it back to what Liz was saying yesterday, is that this was very early in our process. This is this is almost 10 years ago, and I was really interested in designing the object. right, in making a beautiful interactive table. But what we realize is that we're putting it into the ecosystem of this museum, and how it's maintained and how it continues to have a life really depends on the values of the museum. So that, I think, is what has been really interesting when we look back at the work.
So then I went after that to the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, and there was a culture in which educators were a crucial part of the experience. And so that was already kind of built into the system, that when you experience this historic house, you're going to be experiencing it through the mediation of a person, and you're going to go with other people on it. So it's very radical in the sense that it's really about people and groups and moving groups through stories and space together, and that's just in its analog form.
Right.
So,
and one thing that I like to say is about the Tenement Museum's process was that they were already very interactive. Like when I talk about oral storytelling, like in many ways, their educators are using those techniques to interpret history for groups of strangers as they come in. And so how do you connect to those people? And so what we realize is that there's a lot of that oral storytelling, and those techniques get you a certain amount, and that they had really exhausted, and not exhausted, but they were using every part of their capacity to communicate their story so far, and there were still more stories that they wanted to tell.
oh, in this slide, just briefly, in the back you see that's our technical mission, but you can't recite it. If you put a gun to my head, I couldn't recite it. It's too long and it's too many clauses together. So my department actually, in order to give this meaning, came up with our own mission statement for our department that is not antagonistic to the official mission, but is just one that we can actually use in day-to-day life, and that's elevating the stories of ordinary people to inspire connections, past and present. So again, even in that definition, I think what you see is the importance of people, connecting people of the past to the present, people of the present to one another, the visitor to the educator. And in that picture of the building, you could see that we had these tours that went on the first, second, third, and fourth floor. But our new exhibit that we were planning when I joined, it was called Shop Life, and it was for the lower level, a place that had been the home for commerce for over a century. And so we knew we were going to create a saloon. There was John and Caroline Schneider had run a saloon there from 1864 to 1886. And that was something that the founders of the museum discovered very early on, and were so excited about it forever. And we finally were able to go and do that. So that's the saloon, and the saloon was done in very traditional tenement ways, restoring a space and creating an immersive space. And originally it was just going to be the saloon. But then we realized through going through the layers of the building that we actually were able to kind of connect to different moments in time. And after the saloon moved on, there were over 30 stores that came and went. And so we wanted to continue the tradition that the tenement had of traveling through time and showing not just one time period, but another, so that you could experience history and change over time. The problem was we had this list of 30 stores. We narrowed it down to 3 stores that we were fascinated by. The Lustgarten's butcher store that was attacked by striking women in 1902. Max Marcus's auction house. Who could resist this picture of Max Marcus and the mustache? We even had oral recordings of him speaking, and he has that New York accent that you think all New Yorkers will have if you didn't grow up in New York, and then you get there and you don't. And then Sydney and Francis ran an underwear store in the 60s and 70s. We also had recordings of them. So we could not decide.
All in the exact same space, and that's the amazing part of the Tenement Museum, just seeing, how this place, transmits history. You don't think of who else lived in your apartment, and they surface that.
But it was a huge problem for us because we really couldn't decide which one to do. And we realized if we picked one, we would effectively destroy the other 2. And that's where technology came in. And this is just a video that shows a little bit, and we'll talk over it, but essentially what we did with Potion is we created a sales counter in which different objects represented different elements of the 3 different stores that were there. And so after being given an introduction to the space, visitors would go select an object, bring it to the table through RFID tag, be able to then channel a series of images, primary sources, and also audio that help them tell a part of the story of one of the stores that was in that space. And so this happens, one person next to someone here is doing the 30s and then the 60s, and everyone's doing something different for about 10 to 15 minutes.
So what I think is interesting is, sure, this is interactive. So you put everyone chooses an object and they put it down on the counter. You can browse the primary sources. But I think that the most interesting interaction actually begins to happen after that moment, because in that moment, everyone is sort of primed with a piece of a story. So they all have a story. There are up to, 15 spots. And so now you have 15 strangers who all have threads of a common story of this space. So.
And this is where, and this was such a challenge, because even though the technology made this possible, talking about 3 different stories in one space at one time, the technology also created a lot of very old-fashioned work, in the sense that we no longer had to prepare the research for one store. We had to do 3 stores. We had to not only prepare the presentation so an educator could deliver it, we had to then take those stories and break them down into different pieces. We no longer just had to deal with words and text for the most part. Now we had to deal with an array of images, also audio, and then video, because we use the counter to also at the very end have videos of contemporary storekeepers on the Lower East Side today. So there was a ton of work that this facilitated, and the other big challenge was, how do you go from an educator-led tour through the Saloon and then transition into a space where people are going to explore on their own, then bring them back together? And so there was a lot of analog testing on this. There was a lot of formative evaluation even before the counter was launched. We used first manila folders with different pieces of information that visitors would get. Then we had the program run through software, and we would have people one at a time. Then we had a mock counter built with 2 people. And then even when it was finally in situ, we were bringing people through tours for about 3 months before we opened to the public and charged tickets. And this is Julian, who is educating. And so this is the key part, and I think this is what Phillip likes the most, so I'll let.
Okay. So in this moment, what happens is after the interaction, so everyone had their interactive moment, then Julian asks, so can someone tell me a story? And inevitably, someone from the audience begins to say, well, I found this brick, and it came through the window, and then they begin talking about it, and then someone else picks up a thread because they were like, oh, that was the butcher shop. I had the apron. And then as they are speaking and as they are beginning to piece together the story, Julian actually has access to images from all of those time periods. And so he begins to illustrate their conversation, and then he begins to add, and it's like, oh, and so what happened after that? And so begins to start to pull in threads, and you can go, from present to past, from past to present, and this requires, someone who really knows their material. But that's something that Tenement always did. We're relying on the strength of their educators, but we're giving them superpowers. We're giving them the ability to now be able to tell a real-time digital story with a new audience. What, 5 times a day? 7 times a day, right? And so that to me is super exciting, and that the interaction that happens not just with the counter, but with the educator in a conversation that they could not facilitate manually. Right.
And this requires a heavy investment in staff and staff training, because what would happen is educators would come up with their own ways to work the table. They had the freedom to do that within certain parameters, but it still meant it's that balance of making sure they have enough content but not too much content, but then they have enough freedom but not too much freedom, and also how you can take best practices that they're developing and share with the broader. And I still wish we even had more. I wish we had a staff person just engaged right now and watching it as it's happening, because this can keep evolving. But the point is, you need to invest in staff to make something like this work.
So we began to ask ourselves, can we understand what qualities make great digital storytelling? This is, we're all of you want to make great stories, and so can we help you understand that? And I'm going to say yes, but for us. The yes is still has that triple star on it, because I think that when you look at the work that we have made together, we've looked at it and there's this collective social piece. It's very interactive, and there's a strong component of narrative and interpretive content. And I think each of these sit on an axis or on a continuum. There's individual, there's passive, there's data driven, and what we realize is that these values are sort of values that are important to us, but may not be important for you.
And more importantly, there can be excellent digital projects that are on the opposite side of the continuum that we're interested in. But
right. So what we did was we actually went through the Muse Awards, and Annie did most of this work, and went through and just rated them across these axes. So we created this plot, and we now I can't open it. Well,
you
don't need to go to the link, but now I can go to the link. So I'm not connected to the internet. Never mind.
And in this, though, so I went through so many, and the caveats, of course, are that I didn't experience all of them. Some of them are able to see just because they had better documentation than other projects. But the process of it was so enlightening, because I was also able to see how a project that didn't necessarily have the same emphasis on the end of the continuum that we did could have amazing and inspiring projects. So the Peabody Essex Museum had this amazing podcast on Thomas Hart Benton, and it was a podcast, so it wasn't totally interactive, and it was really, I listened to it as an individual, but the narrative was so rich and so warm and so exciting that I derived so much inspiration from it. There was also another project in England, the Art Detectives Catalog, where people would put up paintings, and different people in the public could try to identify the paintings, and they've been able to discover information. So this was a wonderful collective and interactive project that wasn't narrative at all. But so that in surveying the field, you really can find out what are the projects that you can get inspiration from, but also then you find the projects that you really want to be like as well. And both are helpful.
Right. And so, in sort of creating your own axes and looking, it allows you to sort of be able to value what's out there and see where you would like to be and where your institution or your museum, where they sit in sort of this space. So we wanted to talk about something that scored a 5.55 for us, which is the New York Hall of Science Connected Worlds. And this is not a project that we worked on, though we've both been there. And I think it's really interesting because because it's a very narrative and interactive space. This is what you're seeing here is this is a large interactive projection, and kids, adults, anyone can come into this space and plant trees and move water around essentially the ecosystem. And what's amazing is when you walk in, there's no interpretation on the surface, right? There's no text. There's no, you're basically given an introduction, and you're not given any instructions. There's no label text. There's nothing that happens here, and everything happens through discovery, through interaction, which I think is amazing. I know Theo Watson, who is one of the primary authors on this, and he's been working on this for a long time. But I think what's amazing is that what happens is by interacting with this ecosystem, and this is so you can see the sense of the scale, like what this ecosystem was designed to teach was water management. Like, this story is about what happens when there's not enough water for the world. And so each of these ecosystems, if you make this one grow, another one will die. And if there's enough people on the floor, basically people are trying to take water from each other. And so after 10 or 15 minutes, you immediately get to these concepts of how do you manage the water so that we can all sort of get along and get together. And so here's a project where that's actually a very narrative arc that you move through. You go through and you understand sort of how these ecosystems live and die. It's very interactive, it's very experiential, and I think it's very social. Like this space is designed to accommodate a large group of people, and if you were doing it by yourself, you wouldn't even notice that you were taking water away from someone else.
So the only thing I would add to that is when I was there and observing, a class came in and there was an educator who kind of just briefly introduced it, which was fine. And then about 15 minutes in, or maybe 10 minutes in, she paused things and called them all together. And I got really excited at that point because I thought she was going to really guide them or get them to a conversation. But she just basically said, okay, now you have to do this. And it wasn't like that elaborate. And I just thought there you had like this teaching moment. You could have done even more with it because it was so engaging. And it could have been that was just the day that I was there, and I'm sure there are wonderful educators doing wonderful things on other days. But for the most part, what this did again too, in addition to being narrative, in addition to being interactive, in addition to being social, it re-emphasized for me the excitement of thinking about having this technology, but then taking the technology and that experience and adding a kind of human educator-led interaction, and how that can often amplify what's best in an educational museum.
So, here were our pieces, but I think that, and our axes, but what I think is really important that when you do this exercise, when you're planning your interactives and your stories, that you find the right values for your culture. And cost might be one of those axes, maintenance or some of the more practical things, or aspirational. I mean, I think that you really understand sort of how you build that so that it can be accepted into your ecosystem. So coming back to the fruit, we promised that we would answer this question, why should my museum make digital stories? So I want to take a stab at that, and I think that there's to try to answer that question based on sort of what we've reflected on and what we've talked about today. Number one, what's good, quote unquote, depends on your museum's culture and values. That all those projects on that grid were Muse Award winners. Like, these are already top of the top. But how do you know what's good for you, and how do you design for that? And how do you make decisions about, because there are many ways you could take your projects, how do you decide where you want to push your project? I think this is a good one for you, do you?
Okay, I think that we've said it a million times already, but digital amplifies our human ability to tell stories from multiple perspectives and can give your staff superpowers. So again, the opportunity to tell a story from multiple perspectives and get different nuances out of the stories that you might not otherwise be able to do in a more traditional storytelling form. And then again, not losing the educator. If anything, because you're using the digital, you need the educator, you need the human in there. And that requires a lot of maintenance.
And here, visitors become interactors. That's a term that Janet Murray at Georgia Tech has coined. So, they become actors in the story and in their own interpreters, and can create their connections for themselves. I think that, as much as we provide interpretation and guide them and scaffold them in that activity, what we're really excited is that digital stories give that opportunity, to speed up that process, but to give that opportunity to visitors. And then I think that digital storytelling gives you the power to take on big questions and complexity that can't be answered sufficiently through a single story or a single point of view, which if you didn't have digital, you might be limited to. So those are our reasons, and actually, part of this is that this is a draft of the way that we're thinking, and I hope that everyone's been sending us questions, so you can send us questions via Twitter. We'll obviously do some questions and answer right now, but I think what we're really interested in this as an ongoing conversation, and that if you have other axes that you want to throw up and we want to talk about, or you want to say, no, that's wrong, we really want to hear, because you are in the trenches in terms of making stories, and we want to see how we can help and how we can help share those best practices.
That's right. And again, there's we hope that you can come join us when we create this conference in May in New York, where we'll be looking at these terms, hearing different people in the field talk about them, trying to create panels that are helpful both for people from smaller institutions who don't have huge budgets to others who might not have to worry about budgets if those exist. But then also we'll have a series of site visits to history, science, and art museums in New York City. And so it's a kind of a mix between site visits and then workshopping, so that everyone who comes to this, there's like an application process, but everyone who comes shares a project that they're either haven't even begun yet, but they're thinking of, one they're in the middle of, or one they've completed. So we can show different points of the process as well.
So that's...
Oh, you'll have to go through LaGuardia Airport, though. Yeah. That's the only problem. I do there. That's the only option.
So we tried to make that quick so we could have some questions, and thank you so much. So yes?
So this was great, and the Tenement Museum is one of my favorite places.
Okay.
And I think part of the reason is because you can really feel that it's actually cold. It's almost like you can tell the layers are there.
Try to speak up for the...
Or do you want to come up actually
Yeah,
and talk? Do you mind coming up? Yeah, because that...
Oh, we have wireless.
Test.
We should have walked around with those.
So I was saying thank you. This was great. And and that the Tenement Museum is one of my favorite places, and part of the reason is because the stories are told within this context that feels old. You can feel the sort of palimpsest of stories, the layers. And I'm wondering how you bring that part of the equation into this physical, digital interactives that you're doing. And I noticed, and I tweeted this, but I noticed that that table, not only are you touching objects, but I looked like it had a wood panel there and a wood base. So how are you incorporating sort of the materiality of the tenement's ethos or pathos into that?
That's a great question. And actually that counter was an 1890s sales counter that was in an Orchard Street building, but we had to cover it with a laminate to be able to do the projections and things like that. But the room that it's situated in is a ruined space, so you see the layers of paint as well, and you see the pressed metal. I think in that room, which is kind of unlike the Saloon that you're in previously, which is a historical, a recreation, recreation. You then go through one of our traditional ruins, which we've always had, which is like just a room that just shows the paint, all those layers, and has a case with just different objects. So people are kind of primed to start thinking about objects and how one room can have many different time periods. So in a way, by the time they get to that room, they're also thinking about those layers. But you're absolutely right in the sense that now you're in a room where the focus is in many ways on the technology as opposed to the container that it's in. But what I would suggest is that the layers there become the layers of the stories, maybe even more than the material culture. But the material culture is so important, we don't want to lose that.
Yeah, and we really tried to make the technology be able to go away. So when you walk in, there isn't a big screen. You don't even realize those projections that come up on the wall until the educator brings them up. So until they're ready to sort of reveal that magic, the room feels like a regular room.
But the challenges also come up because we have a new building, and we'll be creating a new exhibit on post-World War II era families that lived on the Lower East Side and in that very building. So a family that survived the Holocaust and came in the late 40s and lived there in the 50s, a Puerto Rican family that came in the 50s and lived there in the 60s, and a Chinese family that came there in the 60s and was there through the 80s. And so that story, which we will be telling with all the layers, before we launch is the Bricks and Mortar tour. We're trying to get some of those stories on a web, and that's what we've been working through with Potion. And we tried, and I don't know that it's successful, but what we tried to do to get those layers of history and the physical material of it is have like the stories interspersed with like pictures of doorknobs and different architectural elements. But it's not the same immersion, obviously, as being in the space. And we're really struggling with how do we tell a story on a website as opposed to what we've done before.
Okay, other questions? Thank you. Anybody? Yes, in the green. Here.
want to make sure we can get in the recording. So this is really fascinating. This is really great, especially for us as we're looking to enhance our storytelling in our physical space. But also, what about, what do you guys think are some good examples that you've seen of storytelling in virtual spaces, on the web, and engaging people, museum swear jar there, engaging people on the web?
Why don't you start and then?
I think that one of the things there are some, I think, interesting things that are happening. I mean, one of the things that it's maybe not web, but it's mobile. Like, the New York Times just launched NYTVR, and you're starting to see sort of a new kind of immersive story, form emerge. And so I think that that's pretty interesting to watch and to experience. And though I think that right now it's somewhere in the Lumiere brothers era of filmmaking, and in terms of that, they're really learning and understanding the conventions. Thanks, Daniel, for that reference last night. We are, it's going to be really interesting to make experiments in that space, right? To try to understand how that immersion, which is individual. You're still putting on these glasses. And I don't even think that you can spend that much time in that space. It's like you look around and there's some novelty, and you're like, okay, I'm going to put this down now. How we can extend experience there, and what are ways that we can use that to tell important stories. So I'm really interested in that.
And there's a great site, and I'm blanking on the name. I was trying to look through my notes to find it. Is it called Welcome? It's about different ideas of science and medicine that played through. And I'm sorry that I can't remember exactly the name, but it's beautiful and it's really immersive, and you can click on different links and go further into the story, but yet not lose the thread of the story. But that, I think, is the tension we experienced in building our website, is that we in our first iteration of it, we wanted it, our virtual tour rather, we wanted it to be very interactive, so people had lots of choices. What happened is that in all those choices, the storytelling got lost. So we scrapped that, ran back to Phillip and said, please work with us. We aired. Help us fix this with a limited budget. And we really went back. We went back to storytelling with less interactivity because of it. But that's the tension at least we ran into on a website, is how do you get both narrative and convey the feel of what you want to do and get interactive. And so the way that we resolved it is we have this kind of storytelling about the three families that lived in the building, but the interactive is the user-generated component in which people share their own stories, hopefully inspired by some of the other stories. But it's not it's tricky, and I feel like we're really, really struggling with it. But the struggle is helpful.
I think that the piece that is working or will is the Your Stories, Our Stories piece, where they're actually collecting stories online. And there's another project where so you're taking advantage of sort of a crowdsourcing piece. Again, that piece that is impossible or impractical to do without the digital. So I think there's some interesting pieces there. There is one site that I think is a very interesting website. It's called The Network Effect, and it's by Jonathan Harris. He's a pretty famous digital artist. And what he's done is he's taken 10,000 clips from YouTube that show like the top 100 human behaviors. And it's an interesting piece because even though everything is, I heard them speak about it, even though everything is pulled from YouTube and is human behavior, it feels very cold to me. It still feels very sort of, yeah. And I think that that's sort of the comment it's trying to make. So again, I think that that's an interesting site to look at when you're looking at sort of crowdsourcing or taking data as story. But that's a different kind of story than the sort of narrative interpretive ones that we're valuing here. Yes. Hi, Rebecca.
Can you guys talk a little bit about the process of developing the concepts for the interactive and the role of the exhibit designer and the digital designer?
You're from Blue Cadet, so you know the answer to this question. Well, I mean, I think that one of the really important things that we do in our process is before we start concepting, we really spend a lot of time in research and discovery. So we really try to understand, what stories and what the institutions that we're working with, as I said, so as we've sort of reflected here, like the more we understand a culture, the more likely we're going to be able to make something that can be, exist in their ecosystem.
And in part because we have no budget unless we fundraise for these projects, so everything we've done has been a result of fundraising. So we're really grateful to the National Endowment for the Humanities and IMLS. But what that means is that to do those applications, you have to do a lot of at least the story work and a lot of the kind of who's going to support you and who are some of your partners. And so when you get the grant, in some ways you hit the ground running because you can then go to Phillip and say, look, we have this story, let's work together with it. But we've done work before we get there as well, I think.
Yeah, I think that's really important, is that, the partners that are our best partners have a deep understanding of what they're trying to achieve and the stories they're trying to tell, and that gives us such a huge leap in towards of like being able to come up with concepts that align with those stories.
And flexibility too. So even though you're coming with a story that you might have an idea that you have to leave room for the fact that in that interaction you're going to come up with new ideas that might alter significantly what you thought you were going to do. So I think coming at it with a strong sense of your material, but being willing to be flexible, because that is going to yield the most fruitful and productive, I think, projects.
And we all want fresh fruit.
Yes.
Sorry, wait. Yeah, okay, hold on. And then we'll come back.
So my question is so with traditional storytelling, it's kind of a linear fashion, and so you kind of have like a midpoint and a resolution and things occur. But in an interactive kind of environment, it kind of presents this open world challenge. You see it a lot in video games where you can get lost doing things without knowing. So what kind of things have you guys sort of seen or challenges that can help direct that back down that path?
Yeah, I think it's a big balance, and I have to say that the last time I played a video game was when my Frogger console, so I'm not the best the best person to talk about games. But that tension between giving a lot of room to play, but ultimately having some kind of conclusion. And so at the Tenement Museum, we always have to go back to our mission and that idea of connecting past to present. So the way that we ended Shop Life is that we selected, and the educator gets to pick which one based on the way the conversation is going, but we have about 6 different 3-minute videos of storekeepers in the neighborhood today that represent different aspects of the immigrant experience, the American dream, the community that's formed within a store, and then you get to pick one and watch it together and then have a more open-ended conversation about, how does this connect to the Schneider Saloon that we saw earlier in the tour. So I think you still have to, even as you're leaving a lot of room for open conversation, you still have to plot out where you want to end up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's that tension is huge. I think network effect, just to touch on that, is pretty interesting in that they create a false scarcity. So they only allow you to interact with the site for 7 minutes. So it creates this anxiety that I can only click around for 7 minutes. But also because of that, you're actually paying attention more, because in 7 minutes I can't log in until tomorrow. So there's that's sort of a gimmick in my mind, but there is that trying to get focus and attention. We're in a very distractible world, and so how do you create a moment where we know you can complete this sort of story or this task, and sort of how much time you have, so that you can manage your own time in that experience. And so that's something that I think is important. Yes?
Thanks. So I know that you are going beyond storytelling as one might imagine with this red line of linear narrative that especially is sort of voice-driven, but it has raised questions for me that I hadn't thought about before because you listed, there's sort of different nodes that you've brought up, like oral history, for example. And I'm wondering whether it's research that you've done or read or experienced about the different impact that is made when it's human facilitated, quote unquote, storytelling. The example was great with you up there with the kids, and I'm sure it wasn't just that you were facilitating, but it was your smile, it was your body language. I mean, it was the whole, that kind of reading that we do that's sort of energetic, if I can. But I'm wondering about if you guys have, how you've thought about that, or again, like what research there is out there on that.
So this, I think that we're grateful to all of you and for this conference because it did give us the opportunity to step outside of what we're doing and reflect on it. So we haven't been doing research on it at all. We've just been kind of, I think, experiencing it. I mean, I try to read stuff that's out there and go to conferences, but there hasn't, I'm sure people have written about it and have written things in a much more sophisticated way than we presented today. But I do think that, one of the things, sometimes to be honest, sometimes I'm experiencing it because I'll go somewhere else and there's this amazing digital interactive, but I'm left kind of like, where's the human connection? Where are the people? I've become so, because of the experience I've had, I've become so enamored, even with all of its complications, of the very simple fact that people like to learn together, and learning together makes things better. Not always, and I'm sure people can, but that's just my sense, and so that's where I feel like we really want. That's something that I think we want to research further in a way. It's and something we kind of came upon.
No, and I think that the idea of giving you superpowers, both as a visitor, but also for the staff to interact in new ways. Like, those are sort of some of the conversations and some of the areas that we're interested in exploring in our work. And again, what I want to caveat this is that, digital storytelling is a huge field, but that this is a particularly interesting area for, given sort of my mission was sort of to amplify humanity to motivate change and to generate empathy. Like the addition of the human component is like super interesting to me. Yes.
Yeah. On that note, the perception for digital media, especially when you have audiences that are of an older generation, is that digital media, especially on like a web app or something, or even any type of screen, that is an antisocial activity, and you're going to a museum to be a part of a community, or you're being a part of this institution that's sharing something publicly. So how do you get over that perception, and what are the best ways to make digital interactives not antisocial?
So it's funny because when we did some of this testing, the way that we did it was very old-fashioned too. When we had this program running through the software and just a computer that we would project on a screen, and I then had another computer that I'd have to watch to play the right sound and audio because it hadn't yet been linked together. We would capture people from their tours. So when a tour would start, I would just be like, hi, we're testing something out. Would you want to come with me? We'll give you some cookies. And people would. People would come,
People love cookies.
So, I mean, our sample was skewed in that we only had people who wanted to come with us, but, short of handcuffing them, we couldn't do anything else. So we did this a lot, and one of the hardest was an elderly woman who came, and she just kind of got so frustrated, and she said, why can't you just tell me the story? Just tell me the story. And I said, we could. We could, but if we did it that way, we'd have to tell one story. Is there one story you want us to focus on? But then she said, no, I like all the stories. So even in that moment, and I have to say that most of our visitorship, especially that comes during the day, who does this, are people, we have lots of school children who do this in another form, but on a public tour, a lot of people are in their 60s and 70s, and we have not had people like walk away from it or get frustrated from it. I mean, I think sometimes what will happen is if it's someone who's not used to it, they'll do it with their child or with their friend, and that's totally fine. We allow that kind of social grouping in that sense. But for the most part, these people our experience has been that people are really savvy, with their phones, and they connect that way.
Yeah, and I think there's two aspects to your question, and one, I think that there is an assumption that if you are older, that maybe it is more difficult to connect. But I think that someone mentioned this to me, is that the Ethels is sort of a generation of older say women, and is the primary audience for this particular location, and they said they don't consider themselves ethels, right? They don't consider they want to be as hip and engaged with technology as everyone else, and I think that's a stereotype that is propagated and unfairly, right? That is a that there's a discomfort there. So that's one piece that I wanted to sort of talk about. But then the second piece, which is I think, so let's not say an interactive that's designed to be social, but now we have an app in a museum or something that's on your own personal screen. I think that there's one thing that they showed, at the talk yesterday, the swear jar talk, was this idea that people could be engaging in a different way, and the signaling of what you're doing when you're looking at a screen is very difficult to understand right now. That maybe she's making notes about my talk, or maybe she's emailing someone else, but I don't know that. And so how do we understand how to properly know whether people are actually engaged or not? I think that's still an open question.
And we actually in our tours at the Tenement Museum, we ask people to put away their phones. So we're very explicit about saying, put away that and be part of this. Usually it's not a problem. I mean, there will be people who will still get a text in the middle, or their reservation restaurant, their reservations are available at Ruth and Daughter, so they're going to leave. But for the most part, people will put the phones away, and I think that is really valuable. We don't allow pictures inside, and I think that you could argue with that, and you could say we're taking away a form of the visitor's interaction with our space, but we so prioritize the communal, facilitated storytelling that we're willing to say, we're not going to do that there. Although a museum studies person asked me why we didn't allow tweeting because she said, I'm tweeting back to my people in the university where I am, and why are you stopping that? And then I just paused, and someone else said because they're trying to aim for a different kind of experience, and it was just answered there. But I think that's also a key thing, when to know to tell people to turn off the technology because of something else, and I think that's very valid.
So I think we have time for one more, and I hope if we didn't answer your question, you can tweet me.
And we'll also be here physically after.
Yes. Any other questions? We've got 15 seconds.
I'll try and keep this brief. I guess I had a question that maybe relates to defining digital storytelling for the purposes of the conference. And I wonder if maybe a piece of that work for you guys won't be thinking not just about what is storytelling using digital platforms or tools or even methodologies, but what is storytelling, full stop, in a culture and society which has become fundamentally digital. I wonder if there's some thinking about that.
Yeah, in fact, the keynote speaker that we're bringing in, we made a point of saying this keynote speaker should be someone who could speak about storytelling, but not necessarily digital storytelling, and not necessarily someone from a museum world. So we kind of want to start out with that, and we're close to securing that person, but I can't yet say who it is. But she's very cool.
But I think
she did some digital work as
but,
well. But
I mean, one thing that we've talked about, and it just repeatedly in our conversation, is that what's interesting about digital storytelling is that it actually amplifies the storytelling. So when you actually need more story. They had to develop 3 whole, storylines and be able to speak to them in a way that if they had not gone digital, it would have been easier, right? But that it also brings focus onto the storytelling. If it's not good, then why did we make it digital? So I think that it's really important that you understand the stories and you understand how the digital amplifies the pieces that you are willing to amplify,
And I think the two in relationship have to make the other better than they would have been if they weren't together.
Right. 2 great things that go great together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.